What's up, Wildcats? Today we're going to read chapter 5 of a series of unfortunate events. We're back broadcasting from the principal's office headquarters. Surprisingly busy today. We're working on, we're going to be distributing Chromebooks to all 2nd through 8th graders. So it's a lot of work kind of organizing that. So that's going on today. We know that some kids, for whatever reason, aren't going to be able to use the Chromebooks. We're making sure we get photocopies of all that work. Ready for parents tomorrow to come and pick them up if they need to. We're also been calling teachers and working within our departments because this is the first time we've ever done anything like this. So we want to make the lesson plan access on our website so the kids can see what they do each day a little easier for all students to kind of understand. So we're working on that. So this is the first time we ever did it, and we think that next week it's going to be a lot crisper, a lot clearer for for parents, for students, for teachers. But we're doing our best, and we're looking forward to having everyone with Chromebooks very, very soon. But let's talk about our book. So last chapter, we have the 3 kids, and they're told they have to make a dinner for Count Olaf and all of his theater troupe people. And these people are not very nice. They were rude. Count Olaf's like, why didn't I get roast beef? Even though he didn't ask for roast beef. At one point, he picks up little baby Sunny and threatens to drop her. Maybe he even wanted to, who knows. At another point, he actually either smacks or punches Klaus in the face, and which you should never hit a kid, 100%. And then, his friends, instead of the theater troupe, instead of saying, man, that's messed up, they all laughed and kind of cheered him. So we know, they're an evil group. We know that Count Olaf's very evil. And the kids are very sad. So here we are, chapter 5. Boom, boom, boom. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you may have been very, very lucky, you know that a good long session of crying can often make a person feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one little bit. So it was with the Bolidar orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning, feeling as if the weight of the world were on their shoulders. The 3 children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning's note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard. And as Violet and Klaus swung the axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action, while Sunny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Count Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I'd rather take my chances on the street than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortunes would befall on the streets, Violet pointed out. At least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now instead of when you come of age, Klaus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it with armed guards patrolling outside to keep Count Olaf and his troop out. And I wish we could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in 2, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I wish I could have a large library, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's library, but even more enormous. Gibbo! Sunny shrieked, which apparently meant, and I could have lots of things to bite. In the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Klaus said. She said we're always welcome in her home. But she meant for us to visit or use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean for us to live there. Perhaps, maybe if we explained our situation, she'd agree to adopt us, Klaus said, hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision. And it's not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you know, in your life, have occasionally wished to be raised by different people other than the ones raising you. But you knew in your heart that the chances of this were very slim. I think we should go see Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us off here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. But we don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking towards them at Brimy Beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was, of course, not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs. And I'm sure if he knew how horrible Count Olaf was, he would take us right out of here. Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Boulder orphans inside to go somewhere else, and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here. Okay, he said, let's get this firewood all chopped up and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Boulder orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough, they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map, and decided it must be in a tower where they were forbidden to go. So without directions of any sort, the Boulder children set off for the city's banking districts in hopes of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meat district, the flour district, and the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountains of victorious finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to the Trustworthy Bank, and then to the Faithful Savings and Loan, and then to the Subservient Financial Services Bank, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at the Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street at the Mortuary Money Management. The building was square and rather plain-looking, though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large, echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe, and he led them to a large office with many file cabinets, but no windows. well, hello, said Mr. Poe in a puzzled tone of voice. He was sitting at a desk, covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounding a small frame photograph of his wife and his two beastly sons were three telephones with flashlights. Please come in. Thank you, Klaus said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Boulder youngster sat down in three large and comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but he had to cough into a handkerchief before he could begin. I'm very busy today, he said, so I don't have much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I will put some time aside to take you children to lunch. That would be very pleasant, Violet said, and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation. Count Olaf is a madman, Klaus said. We cannot stay with him anymore. He struck Klaus across the face. You see that bruise? Violet said, just as he had said it, one of the telephones rang in a loud, unpleasant wail. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said, and he picked up the phone. Poe here. And then he said to the receiver, what? Yes, no, yes, thank you. He hung up the phone and looked at the Boulders as if he'd forgotten they were there. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. What were we talking about? Oh, yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him. He's only left to us one bed, Klaus said. He makes us do a great many difficult chores. He drinks too much wine. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said to another telephone ring. Poe here. 7, 6.5, 7. You're welcome. He hung up and quickly wrote something down on one of his papers. Then he looked at the children. I'm sorry, he said. What were you saying about Count making you do chores? Doesn't sound so bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He's always asking about our money. Poco. That was from Sonny. Mr. Poe put up his hands to indicate he'd had enough. Children. He said, you must give yourselves time to adjust to a new home. You've only been there a few days. We've been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a bad man, Klaus said. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of these children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed that the Boulder orphans were saying. Are you familiar with the term in loco parentis? It's a Latin term. Violet and Sonny looked at Klaus, the biggest reader of the three. He was the most likely to know vocabulary words from a foreign language. Something about trains, he asked. Maybe Mr. Poe is going to take them by train to another relative? Mr. Poe shook his head. No. In loco parentis means acting in the role of a parent, he said. It's a legal term, and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you're in his care, the Count may raise you using any methods he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do household chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like your parents' friends better than you like Count Olaf's friends. But these are things that you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis. Understand? But he struck my brother, Violet said. Look at his face. As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for a handkerchief and, covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he had heard her. Whatever Count Olaf has done, Mr. Poe said, glancing down at his papers and circulating numbers, he has acted in loco parentis, and there's nothing I can do about it. Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now, I hate to usher you out in post-haste, but I very much have work to do. The children just sat there, stunned. Mr. Poe looked up, cleared his throat. Post-haste, he said, it means you're going to do nothing to help us, Violet finished for him. She was shaking with frustration and anger. As one of the phones began ringing, she stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sonny. They stalked out the bank and stood on the street, not knowing where to go next. What shall we do next? Klaus said sadly. Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something that could take them out of there. It's getting late, she said. We might as well just go back and think of something else. Perhaps we could see Justice Strauss. But you said you wouldn't help us, Klaus said. Not for help, Violet said, for books. It is very useful when one is young to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are jumping in the air because you're very happy. If you're figuratively jumping for joy, it means you're so happy that you could actually jump for joy, but you're saving your energy for other matters. The Boulder orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from the library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions. Klaus chose some about wolves, and Sonny found the book with many pictures of teeth inside of it. Then they went to their room and crowded together on one bed, reading intently and figuratively, and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable experience. But they did not literally escape, because they were still in his house and vulnerable to Olaf's evil in loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had just escaped. In the situation of orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course. But at the end of the tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny read their books and, in the back of their minds, hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 5. I'm hoping that later I can squeeze some time and we can do Chapter 6. But so far, I like the book. I like the fact that you're reading with me, and we're trucking along. Go Wildcats.